The shock nobody modeled. 2 weeks. That's all it took. Not a recession. Not a slow decline. 2 weeks. Gasoline jumped 25%. Diesel punched through $5. Oil markets lost nearly 20 million barrels per day. That is not volatility. That is system shock. And here's the part nobody is saying clearly. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategic failure. A failure so complete that the world's most powerful military cannot fix it. Because the problem isn't military. It's structural. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway most people couldn't find on a map, has just exposed a weakness at the center of global power. And in the next 14 days, that weakness becomes unavoidable. This is not about Iran, not really. It's about what happens when a system built on global integration encounters a choke point it cannot control. Because when that happens, aircraft carriers don't matter. Missiles don't matter. What matters is math. And right now, the math is breaking. The inflation detonation. Start with the numbers. Because numbers don't panic, they don't speculate, they reveal. As of March 16th, 2026, the American Automobile Association reports the national average price for gasoline at $3.72 per gallon. That's a 25% increase in just 2 weeks. Diesel has crossed $5 per gallon, up more than 34% in the same time frame. Pause there. 2 weeks. This is not inflation drifting upward over months. This is acceleration. Now zoom out. Before the strikes, Brent crude was trading below $90. Stable, predictable, contained. Today, it has broken above $110 with intraday spikes pushing even higher. Why? Because the global market is missing 18 to 19 million barrels per day. That number is difficult to process, so let's translate it. That is not a disruption. That is a systemic supply shock, the largest the modern oil market has ever experienced. And when supply disappears at that scale, price doesn't adjust gently. It reprices violently. Now look at how that feeds into the real economy. Goldman Sachs calculates that every 10% increase in oil prices adds 0.28 points to inflation. At current levels, they've already raised their 2026 inflation forecast to 2.9%. That's not a revision. That's a warning. Then comes JP Morgan Chase. Their scenario is more aggressive. If oil holds between $100 and $150, they project inflation rising by 1.4 percentage points. Think about what that means. Not gradual inflation, not sticky inflation, acceleration. And acceleration is what breaks systems. Because energy is not just another sector. Energy is the input behind everything. Trucking costs rise, food prices follow, air freight rises, supply chains tighten, fertilizer costs surge, agriculture becomes more expensive. Everything moves, everything compounds. This is why inflation spreads faster than it appears on charts. And this is why the public reaction is immediate. According to a Reuters Ipsos survey, 78% of Americans say inflation is a very big concern. Not war, not foreign policy, prices. Because inflation is not abstract. It's not theoretical. You feel it the moment you fill your tank. You feel it at checkout. You feel it when your monthly costs shift without your income moving with them. And politically, that creates pressure because economic perception moves faster than economic data. Approval ratings don't wait for quarterly reports. They react daily, at gas stations, at grocery stores, at rent payments. And here's the deeper problem. There's no quick fix. The White House has already released 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Historically, that's a massive intervention. But in this context, it barely moved the curve. Because you cannot offset a structural global shortage with temporary reserves. That's like trying to stabilize a collapsing dam with buckets. And the market knows it, which is why expectations are shifting. The Federal Reserve is now expected to delay rate cuts, not because growth is strong, but because inflation risk is rising again. And that creates a trap. If rates stay high, economic pressure builds. If rates fall, inflation accelerates further. There is no clean exit. So when you look at the numbers, 3.72 gasoline, $5 diesel, oil above $100, you're not just looking at prices. You're looking at transmission, a shock moving through the system from energy to inflation, to policy, to politics. And the speed of that transmission is what makes this moment different. Because this isn't slow, it's compressed. 2 weeks. That's all it took to turn a geopolitical conflict into an economic detonation. The 14-day clock. Now we arrive at the number that matters more than anything else. Not oil prices, not approval ratings, not military capability, time. 14 days. That's the estimate quietly acknowledged after high-level discussions between U.S. officials and global energy counterparts. 14 days of surplus oil, not reserves, not strategic stockpiles. Floating supply, oil already loaded onto tankers, already in transit, already committed. And once that buffer is gone, the system changes completely. Because there is a fundamental difference between a stressed system and a constrained one. A stressed system absorbs shocks. A constrained system breaks. Right now, markets are still pricing stress, volatility, risk premiums, uncertainty, but they are not yet pricing physical shortage. And when that shift happens, it doesn't move gradually, it snaps. Because oil is not optional. You cannot substitute it overnight. You cannot reroute it infinitely. You cannot negotiate with physics. Which means once supply becomes physically insufficient, price is no longer the balancing mechanism. Availability is. That's when the real consequences begin. Fuel rationing, priority allocation, industrial slowdown, and the kind of price spikes that don't reflect economics, they reflect desperation. Now understand what creates that moment. It's not when oil runs out globally, it's when the system runs out locally. Because global supply chains operate on timing, not totals. A refinery in Texas doesn't care how much oil exists worldwide. It cares whether its next shipment arrives on schedule. If it doesn't, production slows. If multiple refineries slow, supply tightens. And suddenly, the shortage is real. This is why the 14-day number matters. It represents the delay between disruption and consequence. And that delay is already shrinking. Now look at behavior, because behavior reveals what data tries to hide. The United States canceled a major geopolitical summit with China, a meeting meant to stabilize trade relations, canceled. Not because diplomacy stopped mattering, but because the crisis took priority. This is no longer a strategic situation. It is an operational one. Decisions are no longer about long-term positioning. They are about immediate containment, and containment is always reactive. It means the system is no longer ahead of events. It is chasing them. Now step back. What would you expect in a stable environment? Leaders travel. Negotiations continue. Markets adjust gradually. That's not what we're seeing. We're seeing compression, events accelerating, decisions tightening, timelines collapsing. Because once supply chains begin to strain, everything speeds up. Information moves faster. Markets react faster. Political pressure builds faster. And that creates feedback loops. Higher oil prices lead to higher inflation. Tighter policy leads to market stress. And all of it feeds back into confidence. Because at the center of every financial system is belief. Belief that supply will continue. Belief that institutions can manage the situation. The 14-day clock challenges all three because it introduces a hard constraint, a deadline the system cannot negotiate with. And that's what makes it dangerous. Not the number itself, but what it represents. A transition point from uncertainty to reality. Now consider how markets behave around transition points. They don't move smoothly, they gap, they overshoot, they panic. Because once participants realize the system is no longer flexible, they reposition. Fast. Inventory hoarding begins, contracts get repriced, shipments get delayed intentionally, everyone tries to secure supply before everyone else does, and that behavior itself accelerates the shortage. This is how perception becomes reality. Now here's the critical insight. The system doesn't need to fully run out of oil to behave like it has. It only needs to believe it might. That's enough. Because once confidence weakens, the margin for error disappears. And in a system this tight, there is no margin. So the next 14 days are not just a countdown to shortage. They are a countdown to recognition. The moment when markets, institutions, and governments all acknowledge the same thing at the same time. That the buffer is gone, that the flexibility is gone, and that the system is now operating under constraint. When that moment arrives, everything changes, because until now, this crisis has been about expectations. From that point forward, it becomes about limits. And limits are where systems reveal what they are truly capable of handling, or failing to handle. The alliance fracture. Now step away from oil for a moment, because something more important is happening. Something less visible, but far more consequential. Alliances are breaking, and not loudly, quietly, through refusals, through statements that sound diplomatic, but carry structural meaning. Start in Europe, Germany, a country that just weeks earlier signaled alignment with aggressive policy toward Iran, now recalibrating, publicly reminding that NATO is a defensive alliance, not an instrument for offensive operations in the Persian Gulf. That distinction matters. Spain went further, denying the United States access to joint military bases for operations tied to the conflict. Not delaying, denying. And the language used was precise. Warnings against the illusion that global problems can be solved through force alone. Even the United Kingdom, long defined by its special relationship with the United States, chose distance. Careful wording, limited engagement. And when alignment shifts from action to language, you're no longer looking at a coalition, you're looking at hesitation. Now move to the region that matters most, the Gulf, because this is where American power is physically anchored. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. These are not peripheral players. These are the pillars. and they all delivered the same message. No. No airspace access, no operational support, no participation. That changed the equation entirely, because military power without regional access is theoretical. You can have carriers, you can have aircraft, but without proximity, you don't have reach. Why would countries that have hosted American military infrastructure for decades step back at the moment it is needed most? The answer is exposure. In the first 48 hours of escalation, Iran launched missile and drone strikes targeting infrastructure across the region, not just military, civilian airports, energy facilities, logistics nodes, and suddenly the calculation changed. These bases were no longer shields, they were targets. The presence of American forces no longer guaranteed safety. It increased risk, because national governments prioritize survival over alignment, always. The architecture of deterrence has inverted. The bases designed to project strength now attract retaliation, and it's very difficult to reverse. Alliances are built on trust, but the initial action was not collectively decided. Regional partners absorbed immediate risk without having shaped the decision. The Gulf states live next to Iran. The United States does not. That alone shapes decision-making. Geography doesn't change. This is not just about one conflict. It's a pattern where allies begin to reassess risk, dependence, and alignment. It spreads across time. Global power is measured in the willingness of others to act alongside you. When that willingness declines, power becomes more isolated. The deeper shift is in support, not given. Alliances that, for the first time in decades, are no longer automatic. Every future move becomes uncertain. That is the real fracture. Without alignment, even the strongest system finds its limits. And those limits are now being tested in real time. The Strait of Hormuz trap. Now we arrive at the center of the system. Not Washington, not Beijing, not Moscow. A narrow strip of water. The Strait of Hormuz, at its tightest point, just 21 miles wide. And through that space flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. That's about 1/5 of global consumption. Think about that. 20% of the world's most critical resource moving through a corridor. This is not just geography. This is vulnerability. Because choke points are where systems concentrate risk. And when risk concentrates, it amplifies. Now here's the key insight. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't need to be physically closed to stop functioning. It only needs to become unusable. And unusable is not a military condition. It's an economic one. Before the escalation, tankers moved through Hormuz continuously, predictably, and efficiently. Insurance costs were low, transit was routine, risk was manageable. That's what stability looks like. Now compare that to today. Traffic has collapsed. Not gradually, abruptly. From over 150 vessels per day to near zero independent commercial movement. Not because the water is blocked, because the system around it is. Now ask the obvious question. If Hormuz is constrained, why not go around it? Why not reroute supply? This is where the trap becomes clear. Alternative routes exist, but they are limited. Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline, stretching from its eastern oil fields to the Red Sea. Maximum capacity, roughly 7 million barrels per day. But subtract domestic needs, and you're left with closer to 5 million for export. The UAE adds another route, the Abu Dhabi pipeline to Fujairah. Combine both. You get roughly 6.5 million barrels per day. Now compare that to the normal Hormuz flow of 20 million. That means even under maximum strain, you can only replace about 1/3 of lost volume. 2/3 simply doesn't move, and that's before you account for friction, because rerouting isn't seamless. It creates bottlenecks, ports become congested, loading times increase. In Saudi Arabia's terminal at Yanbu, waiting times have tripled from 15 hours to over 50. That delay compounds across the network. Now add another layer, the Red Sea itself. Because rerouting oil doesn't eliminate risk, it relocates it to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Militant groups have demonstrated the ability to target vessels there. So you move oil out of one choke point into another, that's displacement. Now shift focus to natural gas. Qatar supplies roughly 20% of global LNG, and about 93% of that flows through Hormuz. When that flow is disrupted, the effects cascade globally. Asia absorbs most Qatari gas, so when that supply tightens, Asian buyers move aggressively. They outbid others, including Europe. European gas benchmarks have surged, not because Europe lost supply directly, but because competition intensified. That's how interconnected systems behave. A disruption in one region creates pressure everywhere else. Hormuz is a structural dependency, because no matter how advanced the military, you cannot bypass physics. You cannot create new pipelines overnight or expand ports instantly. And that's what makes this a trap. Because once the system is forced into it, options shrink rapidly. Movement is now constrained by economics, insurance costs, risk calculations. Decisions made not by governments, but by private actors. If the cost of transit exceeds the value of the cargo, the ship doesn't move. It doesn't matter how many warships escort it. Power is no longer just about force. It's about systems. And systems operate on incentives. The Strait has always been a vulnerability, but for decades it was a managed vulnerability. That assumption is now broken. Once a system experiences that break, it doesn't return easily. Confidence doesn't reset overnight. Even if transit resumes, it resumes differently. More cautious, more expensive, more fragile. That's the trap. Once participants believe a choke point is unreliable, they behave accordingly. They hedge, they diversify, they withdraw. So the Strait of Hormuz is not just a location. It is a pressure point, one that has now been activated and doesn't simply switch off. It continues to shape decisions, flows, and outcomes long after the immediate crisis fades. That is the trap, and the system is already inside it. The invisible weapon. Now we come to the part that breaks most assumptions, because when people think of blockades, they imagine ships, warships lined across a narrow passage, mines in the water, missiles in the sky, physical force, visible, immediate. But that's not what's happening here. The Strait of Hormuz is not being closed by fleets. It's being closed by spreadsheets. And that changes everything. Because spreadsheets don't need to fire missiles. They don't need to sink ships. They only need to change incentives. And once incentives change, behavior follows. Start with the mechanism. Global shipping doesn't operate on trust. It operates on insurance. Every vessel that moves through high-risk waters carries coverage, hull insurance, cargo insurance, and critically, war risk insurance. This is the layer that matters most, because it prices danger. Before the escalation, war risk premiums in the region were minimal, roughly 0.15% to 0.25% of a vessel's value. Manageable, predictable, part of normal operations. Then the conflict escalated. Missile strikes, drone attacks, commercial vessels hit, and suddenly the risk profile changed. Not gradually, instantly. Premiums jumped to 1%, then higher. By early March, brokers were quoting between 2.5% and 7.5%. And after confirmed strikes on commercial shipping, the floor moved again, toward 10% or more. Now translate that into reality. A modern very large crude carrier, a VLCC, is worth roughly $130 to $150 million. At a 10% war risk premium, one transit through the strait can cost $10 to $15 million just for insurance. Not fuel, not crew, not port fees, insurance for a single journey. Now pause, because this is the moment where the system changes. At that cost, the economics break. Ship owners do not operate on ideology. They operate on margins. If the cost of moving oil exceeds the expected profit, they don't move. It's that simple. And no government directive can override that. No naval escort can guarantee a return on risk, because even if the ship arrives safely, the financial exposure remains. Now add another layer, the concept known in the market as go-away pricing. This is not standard pricing. This is deliberate deterrence. Premiums set so high that the client walks away, not because coverage is unavailable, but because it is economically irrational. And this is where the system reveals its true structure. Because insurance is not centralized, it's distributed across syndicates, across underwriters, many of them operating through a single global hub, London, the underwriting ecosystem that determines how risk is priced for the entire maritime industry. When that system recalibrates, the effect is immediate, because every ship owner, every charterer, every trader receives the same signal. Risk has increased, costs have surged, margins have disappeared, and they respond accordingly. They stop. This is why traffic collapsed. Not because ships were destroyed, because they never left port. Automatic identification system data confirms it. From over 150 daily transits to a fraction, then effectively zero independent commercial movement. Hundreds of vessels now sit idle, anchored, waiting, not blocked by force, blocked by math. Now step back. What makes this so powerful? It's not the scale of destruction, it's the efficiency of disruption. Because to close a choke point physically, you need constant enforcement. Ships, weapons, sustained operations. But to close it economically, you need only a few credible signals, a handful of strikes, a shift in probability, enough to alter how risk is calculated. After that, the system closes itself, and that's the key insight. The most effective weapon in this conflict is not kinetic. It's probabilistic. It doesn't destroy infrastructure. It changes expectations. The United States Navy remains the most powerful naval force in the world, unmatched in capability, in reach, in technology. But it cannot force a private shipping company to accept a loss. It cannot compel an insurer to underprice risk. It cannot override a balance sheet, because modern systems are not centrally controlled. They are networked, decentralized, driven by incentives. This is the structural limit. Military power can secure territory. It can project force. It can deter adversaries, but it cannot guarantee economic participation. And without participation, there is no system. Now here's the deeper implication. What we are witnessing is a shift in how leverage is applied, from physical control to systemic disruption, from visible force to invisible pressure, from destroying assets to making them unusable. And that form of leverage is harder to counter because it doesn't present a clear target. You cannot bomb an insurance model. So when people ask how the Strait of Hormuz has been closed, this is the answer. It hasn't been sealed, it has been repriced. And repricing is enough. Because once the cost of moving through a system becomes too high, the system stops functioning, not by force, but by choice. You don't need to destroy a network to shut it down. You only need to convince it to stop using itself. The Russia windfall. Now step back, because while one part of the system is breaking, another part is benefiting, and not slightly, dramatically. This is where the story turns, because every crisis redistributes value. It doesn't destroy it evenly, it shifts it from one region to another, from one actor to another, and in this case, the biggest beneficiary is not a participant in the conflict. It's Russia. Now go back just a few weeks, before the strikes. Russia's position was weakening, sanctions were tightening, discounts on its oil were widening, revenue was under pressure. Urals crude, Russia's main export blend, was trading at a significant discount to Brent. Buyers had leverage. India and China were negotiating aggressively. Western policy, for the first time in a while, was starting to work. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Then the system shifted, and everything reversed. Because when Middle Eastern supply becomes constrained, the market doesn't stop consuming. It reallocates. And the first question every buyer asks is simple. Where can I get oil without crossing a war zone? There are only a few answers, and the largest one is Russia. Now watch what happens next. India and China, the world's two largest growth centers, pivot fast economically. They increase purchases. They accept higher prices. They secure supply. Because in a constrained system, access matters more than cost. And suddenly, Russia is no longer discounted. It is preferred. Urals crude surges. Prices climb toward parity with Brent. The discount narrows dramatically. That's a structural shift in bargaining power. Now add volume. India's imports of Russian oil increased sharply, reaching 1.5 million barrels per day, a surge of roughly 50% in a matter of days. China follows similar patterns, redirecting flows and prioritizing stable supply to avoid risk. And this is where the windfall becomes clear. Because Russia is not just selling more oil, it is selling it at higher prices. In just 2 weeks, Russia generates billions in additional export income. Not from innovation or strategy, but from opportunity created by someone else's disruption. Now here's where it becomes more complex. This isn't just about market dynamics, it's about policy contradiction. Western strategy focused on limiting Russian revenue through price caps and sanctions. The goal was to reduce their ability to fund geopolitical ambitions, but systems don't operate in isolation. When one supply source disappears, another fills the gap. If that alternative is sanctioned, the system faces a choice. Maintain policy or maintain supply, and supply wins. Every time. Facing a tightening market, the United States made a significant decision. Authorization was granted for the purchase of certain Russian oil cargoes already in transit. A limited window, but symbolically, a reversal. Because the system that was designed to restrict Russian exports now required them to stabilize itself. Now pause. This is where the structure reveals itself. Policy is powerful until it collides with necessity, and when that happens, policy bends quietly. Through exceptions and temporary measures, flow resumes and revenue increases. The intended pressure weakens. Now layer in the geopolitical effect. Higher income strengthens fiscal capacity and currency stability. Instead of being weakened, Russia becomes more stable and more integrated into the system. That's the irony. The original objective of isolating Russia is partially undone. Not by Russian action, but by global necessity. In a tightly integrated global system, you cannot remove a major supplier without consequences. Demand does not disappear, it reroutes. And when it reroutes, it often strengthens the very actors you were trying to weaken. This is a pattern seen across energy markets and history. Russia simply needed to exist as an available supplier. When the system tightened, that availability became extremely valuable. This is strategic patience. So while headlines focus on conflict, there's a parallel story unfolding quietly in shipping routes, pricing spreads, and trade flows. Energy markets do not reward alignment, they reward availability, and those who can provide it win, even if they were never supposed to. The China miscalculation. Now we turn to the assumption that quietly shaped this entire strategy, China. Because beneath the surface of every decision was a belief that pressure on Iran would translate into pressure on China, disrupt supply, raise costs, force dependence, shift leverage. On paper, it makes sense. China is the world's largest energy importer. It relies heavily on Middle Eastern oil. A disruption in Hormuz should, theoretically, hit China hard. But theory is not reality, and reality has not followed the script. Start with what actually happened. Chinese vessels did not continue normal operations through the strait. They didn't push through risk. They didn't challenge the blockade. They adapted. Routes changed. Schedules shifted. Exposure reduced. Major state-linked operators began rerouting shipments, avoiding the strait entirely, diverting cargo toward alternative terminals, even mid-voyage. Because, again, this is not ideological, it's economic. No operator willingly enters a high-risk zone when alternatives exist, even if those alternatives are slower, more expensive, less efficient, because survival comes first, efficiency comes later. Now look deeper, because the real story isn't just rerouting, it's behavior under constraint. China did not escalate. It did not intervene militarily. It did not attempt to force open supply routes. Instead, it observed, adjusted, and absorbed. That's the key difference. Because in a system under stress, there are two types of actors, those who react and those who adapt. China chose adaptation, and that choice matters, because adaptation preserves optionality. Now consider the shipping data. Before the escalation, dozens of Chinese-linked vessels transited Hormuz weekly. Afterward, traffic dropped sharply. Many vessels remained anchored. Others diverted. Some attempted workarounds, using shadow fleet tactics, changing transponder data, masking ownership, trying to navigate risk indirectly. But these were exceptions, not the system. And importantly, insurance markets began to treat all vessels in the region as high risk, because risk is not assigned individually. It is assigned collectively, to geography, to exposure, to probability. So even China's scale, even its global reach, could not bypass the underlying constraint. Now step back, because this is where the miscalculation becomes clear. The assumption was that China would be forced into a reactive position, that it would face immediate pressure, that it would have to respond. But instead, China stepped back, reduced exposure, and allowed the system to adjust around it. That's not weakness, that's positioning, because in a volatile environment, the most valuable position is flexibility. Now layer in the economic dimension. Higher oil prices do impact China. Energy costs rise, margins tighten, growth faces pressure. But those effects are not immediate collapse. They are manageable strain. And in exchange for that strain, China gains something else. Information. Every disruption reveals data. Supply chain vulnerabilities, alliance fractures, policy reactions, market behavior. And China is watching all of it in real time. Because this is a live stress test of the global system. Now consider the strategic perspective. China does not need to win this conflict. It does not need to control the strait. It does not need to intervene directly. It only needs to understand how the system behaves under pressure, where it breaks, where it adapts, where it fails, because those insights are long-term assets. They inform future policy, future strategy, future positioning, and that is where the real advantage lies. Not in immediate gains, but in accumulated understanding. Now contrast that with the other actors in this system. The United States is actively engaged, managing escalation, managing inflation, managing alliances, responding to events as they unfold. Europe is reacting, reassessing involvement, balancing risk, adjusting posture. Regional actors are recalibrating, negotiating, protecting themselves. China is observing that difference matters, because observation does not carry the same cost as participation. It does not require immediate decisions. It does not create immediate consequences, but it produces insight, and insight compounds. Now here's the deeper implication. The miscalculation was not just about China's response, it was about how systems behave. The assumption was linear, apply pressure here, get reaction there. But global systems are not linear, they are adaptive. They reroute, they absorb, they redistribute, and in doing so, they often neutralize the intended effect. Or worse, reverse it. Because while China absorbs pressure, it also benefits from the broader shifts. Higher global uncertainty strengthens its strategic patience. Weakened alliances elsewhere create space. Market disruptions provide learning opportunities. So instead of being cornered, China becomes more informed. Now step back one final time. What does this tell us? It tells us that in a complex interconnected system, you cannot assume outcome, because every action triggers adaptation, and adaptation changes the result. So the idea that disrupting Hormuz would weaken China was based on a static model, a model where actors respond predictably. But reality is dynamic, and in a dynamic system, the actor that adapts fastest often gains the most. Not immediately, but over time. So the China miscalculation is not about failure in a single moment. It's about misunderstanding the system itself, because while others are trying to control events, China is learning from them. And in a world where power is defined by information, that may matter more than any short-term disruption. Because conflicts end, crises pass, but the lessons learned from them remain. And those who understand the system best are the ones who shape what comes next. Now, let's step back. Because everything we've discussed so far, oil, alliances, shipping, Russia, China, they aren't separate stories. They are symptoms of something much deeper, a strategic assumption that failed, quietly at first and then all at once. The assumption was simple, that overwhelming military force could produce fast, controlled outcomes, decapitate leadership, disrupt infrastructure, and force compliance. 3 to 5 days. That was the expectation. Not publicly stated, but widely understood. This wasn't new. It has shaped military planning for decades. Precision strikes, air superiority, technological dominance. The belief that modern warfare is clean, efficient, and predictable. But history doesn't support that belief. Not once. The United States firebombed Tokyo. It flattened cities across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It dismantled infrastructure in Iraq and operated in Afghanistan for 2 decades. In none of those cases did air power alone produce stable political outcomes. Because war isn't just physical, it's systemic, political, and psychological. And systems do not collapse on command. They adapt, absorb, and resist. Now look at what actually happened here. The strikes didn't produce rapid capitulation. They triggered a response. Missiles, drones, and targeted retaliation. And critically, persistence. Because the retaliatory capacity wasn't eliminated, it was degraded, partially and temporarily, but not decisively. And that distinction matters. A system that survives the initial shock does not collapse easily afterward. Consider the secondary effects. Regional radar systems and early warning infrastructure were degraded. Response times shortened. Decision windows compressed from minutes to seconds. This increases uncertainty, risk, and the probability of miscalculation. Now layer in the strategic paradox. The campaign aimed to weaken deterrence and limit escalation. But the effect may be the opposite. When a state perceives its conventional deterrence is compromised, it looks for alternatives, stronger ones. Final ones. This is basic strategic logic. You don't remove pressure, you just shift it toward more extreme options. The more vulnerable a system feels, the more likely it is to escalate in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Strategy doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates under pressure, domestic, economic, and time pressure. We've seen how inflation is accelerating and how timelines are compressing. That pressure makes decisions reactive, not strategic. The United States is now managing multiple constraints at once: energy disruption, alliance hesitation, market instability, and geopolitical backlash. Together, they create a system of limits. And that's the key word, limits. This situation is revealing the limits of military effectiveness, economic control, and policy influence. These aren't failures of execution. They are structural, built into the system itself. For decades, global power has been defined by dominance. But dominance assumes control, and control assumes predictability. In a hyper-connected global system, that predictability is breaking down. Actions ripple across supply chains, markets, and alliances, creating second and third order effects that were never part of the original calculation. This isn't a tactical miscalculation, it's systemic. The more complex a system becomes, the harder it is to control. So what does success look like from here? That definition has shifted. It's no longer about rapid victory. It's about containment, stabilization, and managing consequences. That shift from control to management is the signal that the original strategy has reached its limit. This was never just about a conflict. It was a test of how modern power operates. And the result is now visible. Power still exists, but control is conditional and limited. That is the strategic failure. Not that the system collapsed, but that it revealed where it cannot be controlled. And once those limits are exposed, they cannot be unseen. They become part of every future calculation, because from this point forward, the assumption of absolute control is gone. And that changes everything. Imagine a single flickering light bulb in a windowless room. The air is thick with tension. On the table, a map, not of a battlefield, but of the world's most vital arteries, oil supply routes. A crisis is brewing, a potential global oil shortage that could send shockwaves through every corner of our lives, from the price of gas to the cost of groceries. Time is not on our side. The clock is ticking, and a monumental decision must be made. 2 paths lie before us, each fraught with peril. The first is the path of negotiation. It's the diplomatic dance, a high-stakes game of offers and counter-offers, promises and compromises. Success means we avert disaster, stabilize the markets, and keep the world running smoothly. But what if talks break down? What if one side is bluffing, or worse, acting in bad faith? A failed negotiation could waste precious time, leaving us more vulnerable than before and potentially seen as weak on the world stage. It's a gamble on trust when trust is in short supply. The second path is escalation. This is the show of force. Moving assets, imposing sanctions, drawing a hard line in the sand. It sends a clear, unambiguous message. We will not be held hostage. This decisive action could quickly resolve the threat and deter future challenges. But the risks are immense. A single miscalculation, one step too far, could ignite a conflict with devastating global consequences. It could shatter alliances, wreck economies, and lead to a crisis far worse than the one we're trying to prevent. It's a high-wire act with no safety net. So, what would you do? Would you extend the hand of diplomacy, risking betrayal for the chance at peace? Or would you choose the path of strength, risking conflict to secure our future? This isn't just a hypothetical scenario. These are the kinds of impossible choices that shape our world behind closed doors. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What's the right move when the world is holding its breath? Thanks for watching, and if you find these global dilemmas fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more.